the point of what this work is about. Gnosis is to ultimately know yourself and know your own spiritual nature and your immortality of soul, which was the point of the mysteries. Yes, and talking about the universality of knowledge, don't forget my book on being of knowledge, where I took time out and took 10 years from my busy career, which I started when I was teaching, because I realised that this is the key question, the relationship between knowledge and all the forms that it takes, and existence. So I was inspired by Being and Time by Heidegger and Being and Nothingness by Sartre, and I felt somebody's got to do this book. This is the really important one, Being and Knowledge, because it's really the key nitty-gritty. And in this book I talked about ignorance, the power of ignorance, and I talked about gnosis, and I talked about how can we make knowledge triumphant. We are Homo sapiens here, not Homo ignorans, as you'd think looking around. Well, we're still in existential danger of self-destruction. We're on the cusp of self-annihilation. Why? That's what I looked at this. Why is being so threatened by knowledge? Why do footballers get paid millions and millions of pounds a year, and professors and stuff live on a pittance? If we valued knowledge as much as we do football, the world would go better. So that's why I wrote this book. And I also explore the sociology of knowledge, because I discovered there's a whole field about the interactions of social groups around knowledge, because the suppression of knowledge is a social phenomenon. If somebody comes in with a new perspective, new ideas, like a Jesus figure to the old system, the system gathers together to suppress it and silence it, as did Calvin, in Geneva against Castellio, and so on and so on. So anyway, I've explored all that in Being and Knowledge, which is, again, I've got it now about to come out in publication. I'll be working on the next volumes appearing in print. Okay, I want to move on and do the Islamic Gnostics, because they're really interesting. And they're a continuation of and build on what we've been talking about, the Christian Gnostics. Because what I discovered in my deep study of the origins of Islam over many years, and teaching at the Muslim College in London with Dr. Zaki Badawi, who was Britain's greatest Islamic scholar of the day, graduate of Al-Azhar University, Egyptian. And he also had a PhD from the University of London, like me. We got on really well. And he set a challenge. He said, Thomas, the trouble with you people in the West is you're afraid of wisdom. You're afraid of knowledge. Because of the Adam and Eve story and the snake, and by it led to the fall. So the trouble, you profess to be philosophers and interested in learning, but actually you're terrified of it. However, we in Islam, we love knowledge, and the Quran is like an update on the biblical and Christian texts, and it's pure knowledge here. If you read it as a Gnostic document, and you read through the different levels of text. So anyway, he inspired me to do that, and I've done it. And that's why I did my 10-year commentary on the Quran, which goes into every little level of nuance of meaning in each line of the Quran. It's the first time anyone's ever done it in English. And it's what they call a tafsir, a commentary on the Quran. It's a thing. There are thousands of tafsirs, but this is the first in modern English, which includes scientific approaches to things like archaeology and ethnography and geography, because obviously the Quran was produced in a pre-scientific world. Muhammad had no higher education to speak of. He could have gone and done a degree in Alexandria or in Byzantium. There were learned academies and stuff. He knew nothing about all that. He never did. But he studied in the desert, and his own... So what I've discovered is his wife, Khadija, who employed him, was herself a kind of a Christian Gnostic. And they had a little house church going, of Christian Gnostics in Mecca. She had a cousin called Waraka, who, although blind, was a profound person. And they also, it seems, had an early form of the Gospel of Matthew. They had a variant of the Gospel of Matthew in Mecca. And they had oral traditions in Arabia of some of the Gnostic stories, which you find in some of the Gnostic texts. So, for instance, and they occur in the Quran. Now, as I've explained in my commentary, the only way they got in the Quran is because Muhammad had heard these stories during his missionary trips when he was leading the caravans of Mecca for Khadijah, who was one of the three wealthiest people in Mecca at the time. So they were taking incense and all kinds of stuff around to Hira, which was under the Lakhmid kingdom, which was a sort of Gnostic haven. So there were Manichaeans there. Mani was another of these great Gnostic elders who'd come from Parthian background and integrated all the kind of wisdom traditions. And there were Manichaeans who were in Hira that Muhammad would have met. And he also, I'm absolutely sure, well, we know he went to Damascus, that much is known, but there's the secret history of where Muhammad went. I'm sure he went to Haran, which is where Abraham came from, up in the north of Syria. And again, in a haven of this Gnostic stuff. So Muhammad put all this together, was inspired by his wife, Khadijah, who he married eventually. And he was just a very devout, pious, and a highly intelligent man who believed in righteousness. And he got what we would call downloads direct from source. And so it was my pleasure and honour to go through the Quran, line by line, text by text. But I did it chronologically, which has never been done before, because you cannot understand the Quran if you read it in its current order. The current order is not by chronology, it's by length of surah, and it was agreed by a committee decades after the death of Muhammad, who didn't know what they were doing, with all due respect. The only person that really knew was Ali, and his Quran was in chronological order, but it's been lost. I was at a University of Harvard seminar on Ali recently, and I asked the guy who's an expert on Ali, has anyone found his chronological thing? No, the answer is no. Well, okay, so I've reproduced it. And we do know Islamic studies is now quite advanced to work out the chronological order. And it is a revelation to actually, it's like you're sitting listening as the surahs are revealed. And most of the time Ali was there, writing it down, listening. He was his cousin and he married his daughter, Fatima. And it's absolutely amazing when you go through the Quran, you find all these traces of the Gnostic tradition. And so there are two stories in particular just to share. One is, it's an obscure thing, but there's an infancy gospel of Jesus associated with the name of Thomas, because Thomas went to the East, the disciple, and was a Gnostic disciple. And he gives this story of Jesus when he was a boy. And Jesus was very, very, very precocious, according to this infancy gospel. He was like much cleverer than his playmates. And, you could say slightly arrogant, difficult to deal with. As a teacher, I've met kids like this. They have the answer before you even speak. They know everything, and there's nothing you can teach them. They're really annoying. But there's some beautiful passages in that. For instance, his father, Joseph, despairs of the boy. Nobody can teach him anything. So he takes him to the wisest elder, Jewish sage, rabbi, to teach him the alphabet in Hebrew. And then as he starts teaching, what is Aleph? What does it mean, this wonderful letter? Jesus interrupts and says, why are you teaching me about Aleph? What do you know about Omega then? Do you know about all the other letters? I mean, unless you know the whole lot, you can't make sense of the one you start with. And the teacher despairs and pulls out his hair because the boy starts teaching him. And he already knows the entire alphabet, but he also knows the inner meaning of the alphabet. He's born with a deep Kabbalistic knowledge of the meaning of sounds and everything. And that's in this infancy gospel. It's really interesting. And that's, by the way, set in Egypt, that encounter. Also, in that same infancy gospel, it's sometimes called the pseudo gospel of Matthew. It's one of the versions of this text come down. When the Holy Family are going into Egypt, taking refuge from Herod, so it's baby Jesus who's been born, Mother Virgin Mary and Joseph, they're going into Egypt on a donkey or whatever. And at one point they're crossing a desert bit and they're absolutely hungry and thirsty, there's nothing happening. And they stop by a palm tree and they see some dates way up the top, but you can't get them too far up. And Jesus says, "Oh, bend down." And the palm tree lowers itself down so Mary can have some dates. Right. It's a great story. Well, that exact same thing is referenced in the Quran. There's a passage in the Quran which says, as if everyone's read that story, and it's like when the palm tree bent down to help Mary. In other words, Muhammad knew that story. He'd been taught it orally, and he just repeats it in the Quran. Okay, so now, is the Quran... So my take on the inspiration of the Quran and other such similar sacred texts is that it comes from a higher sphere of gnosis, a higher sphere of enlightenment, if you want, where you plug into the divine consciousness or the divine intelligence. You download the wisdom into your own mind, but as it's coming through, you colour it a bit with your own concerns, your own knowledge. And my job as a commentator on the Quran is to try and work out which bits are Muhammad speaking from his culture and his time, and which bits are God speaking from eternity and the absolute gnosis. And that's a big challenge to me as a commentator, trying to work that out. And I'm not alone. I mean, other philosophers have said the same, both of the Quran and other traditions. But things like that story of the palm bending down, that is obviously something that was floating around the culture of the area. And that's something Muhammad had picked up, and therefore he reproduces it. There's another story, another Gnostic story, of boy Jesus. Again, it's very obscure in this text, the infancy gospel of Christ, when he is playing by a river with some mud. He's making mud pools, which we all do as kids, right? It's fun. And you make little dams and, you play with the water flow, right? And as he's doing that, and he's got other playmates playing there as well, he takes some mud and shapes them into bird-like shapes. So he makes these little clay birds. But Jesus being Jesus, he then holds it up and blows on it, and it becomes a real bird and flies away, right? And this frightens all his little playmates because they've never seen anything like this. And they go and complain to their parents and things. But that story is in the Quran too, in the exact sequence of, it's in one of the surahs where, again, the Quran says, and remember when Jesus made the clay birds. That's what's needed here, So what I discovered in doing this research, and I've never heard of any other scholars that have really done this, because of my knowledge of Christian Gnosticism and my knowledge of universal Gnosticism, I was able to piece together the influences that must have been playing on Muhammad to produce the Quran and his whole mission. Because basically what his self-awareness was, that Jesus had been and gone, they'd crucified him. Yeah, he was in heaven, but his mission had sort of failed. They'd co-opted it and turned it into a state religion, and accused anybody that didn't stick to the rules of heresy, so no freedom of thought there. And Moses had been and gone, the Jewish thing, but that had been turned into a kind of a sort of club for people that were of that ethnicity, but weren't open to the true universalism that it should have been for, which was what Christ had represented, and he'd been killed as a dangerous prophet. So Muhammad felt that it was time to open the wellsprings again and get that prophetic inspiration flowing for all humanity. And that's what his mission was to not only receive those downloads, but to then implement their significance socially and for the community. So what the texts say is there's no priesthood. We're all equal. We all have equal access to God, Allah, the Absolute. The Absolute is there for us all if we turn to it, and if we cultivate righteousness and truth, and if we develop our own gnosis effectively. And Muhammad was fortunate to have been surrounded by many profound thinkers and disciples known as the companions. Ali was one of them, but there were others. And when Muhammad died prematurely and tragically, probably poisoned, I think the consensus is he was killed tragically, enough of that wisdom had survived so that once you have that wisdom, as you called it, what they call it in Sufism, the baraka, which is the spiritual charge that the Sufi elder can give, and then you read the Quran with the baraka, then you understand it. If you just read it as a text, it's just like words, it doesn't mean anything. But once you have the baraka, the grace, then it opens it up to you. Now, fortunately enough, people had that. And so Gnosticism and Islam didn't get killed off when Muhammad died. It survived in the people of the secret, as they're called, the scattered brotherhood, the Sufis. Ali was central to that. But he also, his lineage, his children and grandchildren through Fatima, were also regarded as imams. That means people who could teach that inner wisdom. They had the oral commentary on the Quran, which they transmitted. And ever since that has survived. One branch led to Jafar as-Sadiq, who was an imam and a profound teacher, who had a son called Ishmael, who died early and sadly. But his followers call themselves Ishmaelis in honour of that. And the Ishmaeli tradition is still going. There's a centre of Ishmaeli studies in London, which the Ishmaelis are just unbelievable. They're led by the Aga Khan, who lives part of the time in France here. And they've just had an exhibition on Vasily Doktorov, I think, a great Russian scholar of Ishmaeli studies, who went and travelled around Central Asia learning from them in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. So Islamic scholars and scholars of Islam are trying to reconstruct what is the true Gnostic lineage within Islam. One thing that I can tell you absolutely 100,000,000% is it's not about terrorism and violence. True Islam has never been about that. Islam has given the right to self-defense if you or your community or your village or your family are attacked, but never to go out in violent offence against other people, and never to misuse might for that. So we have a lot of unlearning to do. The idea that Islam is a violent jihadist creed, this is all contrary to authentic Islam. And if you read my commentary on the Quran and all the detailed research I put into it, that becomes obvious. Muhammad identified very closely with Jesus' work. He saw himself as continuing it. I have books on Jesus as a Sufi. Many of the greatest Islamic sages have revered Jesus as Muhammad did. For instance, Ibn Arabi, who was the greatest sheikh of Andalusian culture. The sheikh of sheikhs, he's called. So, Islamic Gnosticism is, I think it's the hope for peace in the Middle East. I've been trying to say for years, if instead of dropping bombs on Palestinians and demonizing them and locking them up and terrorizing them, we should be talking to them about these mysteries. Because Jewish rabbis who understand the Kabbalah should understand the profundity of what I'm saying about Sufi mysticism and the Gnosticism within Islam and within Muhammad's own mission. And just to say, I would say that in my commentary on the Quran, I've also explained how what in Judaism is called the Kabbalah is the same as in Christian Gnosticism and Islamic Gnosticism. It's the same concept that you can receive this inner wisdom that explains the text. So what Jewish sages do with the Bible is they understand its many levels and its nuances and its meanings, and that's explained in the Zohar, which is the great Kabbalistic text. Well, that's what Islamic mystics do with the Quran, and it's what Christian Gnostics do with the Gospels. So my strategy is, why can't we bring those wisdom people together and make a sort of peace treaty between these exoteric faiths, rather than what's happening at the moment, which is, for geopolitical reasons, military powers have been creating havoc and mayhem in the Middle East. Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Gaza, they're all going up in smoke because nobody's listening to the common core esoteric wisdom. And I think that's shocking. But it goes back to the thing of, why is ignorance so powerful? Why are voices like mine so diminished in impact and stature? This is a mystery. Anyway, I'll stop there. But the commentary on the Quran is available on the internet for everybody, and now it's going to be appearing as a text because it's being transcribed into a written form of 1,000 pages. So I'm going to be busy this coming year. 25 is the year of the books. Yes. Okay, any questions?
No, thank you very much, Thomas. Yeah. The last phrase you made is, this is a mystery. But since I understand better why it's necessary to dig this knowledge, to come back at the end to the mystery. It's a kind of dance. And
the symbol of infinity is like that, the 8. Because it's like you come out to the exoteric, then you go deep down underground to the esoteric, come back up to the exoteric, and you keep going round and round. That's infinite. I love it. Anyway, thank you, Muhammad, for your amazing witness, and thank you, Jesus, for your incredible witness. We love you, and now can we please have a bit more power to the Brotherhood and Sisterhood of Light, so that we can face down the military idiots who are trying to destroy our planet, call them out on it. Okay, let's stop there. Let's invoke some deity cards and see if what kind of backup they might give us. And this important work, the last reading of this year. Izanagi.
Ah, Japanese.
Ah, yeah, the Shinto creator god, actually. That's important. Yeah, thank you very much. Oh, yes, well, I've got the devil. That's quite interesting, isn't it? Well, there we are. That sums it all up. This is the struggle between the creator god and the devil.
But that was the core of your introduction, because you spoke about the question for philosophers, why
Yeah.
the devil?
Yes, yes. So he's turned up. Okay. So Izanagi, is in the Tarot of the Gods, because this is a tarot set that deals with the male gods of humanity from all cultures. Where's my actual? I want to get the reference volumes. Just a second. I think I put them next door. Just a minute. How's the fire going?
Yeah, I check.
Okay. So this is the reference books that go with the tarot, which I spent a year writing. First time anyone's ever done a tarot of the male gods. I thought it was important to balance all the goddess tarots that you can get. And we need the kind of male energy to be purified and sublimated and enlightened. Or we can't save this planet, basically. So anyway, Izanagi is the equivalent of the magician in normal tarot decks. And he is he's chosen carefully because in the Shinto religion, which is the ancient Japanese pagan faith, he is the creator of life and this planet and humanity with his consort. And in the Shinto tradition, you can normally, we could all trace our ancestry back to Izanagi, and the emperors had the kind of family tree going all the way back. And I give the whole, sacred mythology, which is in the Kojiki, the Shinto text, of the different generations, and all the other gods come from the two founding gods. They're called kami. And there's an island on a lake in Japan where they say that Izanagi and Izanami first manifested, the sacred couple, and they celebrated their wedding with great lovemaking of many days and nights of passionate embraces. So Shintoism is not against sexuality, it's a sacred thing. And the Shinto temples of Japan are many, and they celebrate this lineage. But then something happens. His wife, tragically, she conceives the fire god, and as she's giving birth, she burns herself and goes into the underworld. And Izanagi tries to go and rescue her, like Orpheus does, and finds her in the underworld. And there's all kinds of adventures and stories, which are fascinating. If you were Freud, you could write whole tracts on these adventures, because it's her vagina that gets burned as the fire god is being born, and that's why she dies and goes into the underworld. And he feels guilty because he caused it. So, and in fact, there are similar echoes with Lucifer, the fire god, who causes trouble in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Poor old Japan got the nuclear bomb dropped on her. I wish they'd managed to sort that out with diplomacy. That the whole World War II conflict between Japan and America and the West was tragic. I've been to the Philippines, which the Japanese conquered, and I went to a chapel in De La Salle University where the Christians were all rounded up by the Japanese and bayoneted to death, just as sort of ethnic hatred against Christians. And true Shintoists would never do that, or true Buddhists. This is just antithetical. All that sort of 1930s fascist stuff that the Japanese got involved with was not real Shintoism. The true knowledge holders, wisdom keepers of Shintoism were peace people. He has a spear, Izanagi, which helps with creation, and the spear's there on the card. And evil magicians can try and get that power and do silly things, but the true wisdom keepers of Japan work with the pure creative energy, because true love comes from shedding the ego, not from brutalizing other people. So I think it's an interesting card to summon the idea of the creator who doesn't quite always get it right. And then we have the other card that we have. I mean, for instance, let me just say that, like, in the Bible, it talks about God is the creator of the world and we should all love God, and every Jewish thinker is supposed to revere the creator. But how can killing 45,000 people in a tiny little area of Gaza with bombs, how is that revering the creator? Surely that's waving the spear in the wrong direction. And this is the problem within certain schools of pseudo thought, which is that it actually just promotes your own particular ethnicity, be you Japanese or American or Arabic. We have to move, as my friend Glenn Martin says, from an ethnocentric world perspective, from an egocentric to an ethnocentric, and then beyond that to a world-centric. We have to realise our universality as human beings. I've met some great Japanese philosophers in my time who know this. And thank you for the work you're doing. Okay, now the devil card. Well, it's there because the devil is a card in the tarot. And it's interesting, why is it in the tarot? And where did the tarot come from? Card 15. There's different theories about the origin of the tarot, and I've gone into it in the introduction to the book. Some say it was an Italian Renaissance thing associated with the Hermetic mysteries of Florence. They were exploring the Hermetic texts. They wanted a kind of pictorial representation of universal wisdom. That's one school of thought. They were also there in the south of France, in Marseille. There's a very early deck in the south of France, Provençal culture as well. But it seems other people say no. Yes, they were there in the Renaissance, but they were there even earlier. There was an earlier form of the tarot in the theosophical schools of Hermetic wisdom in ancient Alexandria. And what they did is they put Hermetic wisdom into a picture book, which then survived. And maybe the Romany people who came through Egypt, hence we call them gypsies, adopted that and used it and took it around Europe to fairgrounds and used it for, scrying. That's another theory. And then the first really important attempt to explain it all was done by a French esotericist and Freemason in the 18th century in Paris, who was the secretary of the Lodge